I have now somehow technically read 10 of these books. Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today we're covering book 9 of The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. And I said I read 10 of these books because I did read New Spring following book 5 way back. At this point, forever ago. I think it was probably like upwards of a year and a half. Wait, no, actually it'd be more like a year ago at this point. But that's neither here nor there. I would say in general, I have enjoyed The Wheel of Time so far as I have read, but there have been some things now and again that I haven't loved about it overall. I just kind of have to say the last couple books of the series have been a little bit more hit or miss in terms of their actual content. That's not that much of a surprise because of the way that people always talk about like the slog, books 7 through 11 kind of in that range depending on who you are. 7 and 11 obviously much less in that conversation than books 8 through 10, but even still, there's that just broader range of the series that generally have slightly lower reviews, slightly lower sentiment amongst even fans of the series. One of those things where I've kind of had a weird relationship with the series. Path of Daggers, for example, you might recall, I teased about it being like easily the weakest book in the series up until that point, but that it was not my least favorite book in the series. Winter's Heart is kind of a different experience for me and does a pretty fine job of not really impressing me with much of anything. And while I will cover this book just as I am normally wont to do with reviews, namely doing the good, the bad, the ugly, and a recommendation at the end, I will also be tacking onto the end of this review, just as I promised in my most recent Wheel of Time diary, my kind of spoiler discussion series about the series. I will be doing a ranking at the very end of the video this time around, so I guess, stick around to hear a little bit more about that. But remember that I said that Winter's Heart didn't really impress me with much of anything. Let's get into the actual review to figure out why that is for me. Starting off, just as I normally do, with the good, I gotta say the one thing that I do have to give Winter's Heart props for is the potential that it shows with most of the important plot lines. It does show a good bit of potential in all of them, namely in, say, the Elaine and Camelin plotline. That's a very good example of being able to see some potential there. I wish there was a little bit more to it, like the actual climactic moment that was kind of just teased at the very end of it in this book, but the setup and the build-up, the promises that are being made in it are all engaging material, and I enjoyed reading the majority of that, I would say. Matt and the Abu Dar plotline is another good example of this. I don't love some of the actual content of the plotline, especially following A Crown of Swords ending, but the actual getting up and Adam and kind of seeing that story pick up to do what it's supposed to be doing was pretty cool. Rand and dealing with basically everything that happens in the climax of the book had some pretty great stuff in it as well. Even though I was, a bit disappointed in the ultimate execution of the climax, getting from that sort of post-Path of Daggers drama up to the climax was genuinely really enjoyable to read. Another thing about this book in particular that I liked was getting some better ideas overall where some of the side characters' motivations are actually at. Robert Jordan has given us a plenty of side character POVs in previous books. This one is one where I feel like where those character motivations actually kind of where they fall in accordance to the main character's plot lines and kind of the broader political dynamic of some of that is starting to coalesce a little bit more by this point in the series, and I'm enjoying being able to see some of that, particularly where like Cadsuane and Viren, even Ilana, and also like more direct, like more, I guess, relevant side characters like Min and Avienda, some of the bad guys as well, being able to just kind of see where their actual motivations are and where the conflicts and agreements and all of that kind of, like I said, political kind of dynamics of a lot of that stuff has been engaging. And in the last couple books, that has been a highlight. Winter's Heart was one of those examples of where that has been a little bit of a highlight. There's just a lot of intricacies to where all of those plot lines are kind of existing, and also to where some of the tertiary plot lines are as well, that feel like they're starting to become important in more tangible and more effective ways, and I'm just enjoying being able to see a little bit more of that. Finally, there's also a couple scenes of Winter's Heart's prologue that is really, really great and actually felt like proper prologue material. I would say the last few books of the series, the prologues have been kind of hit or miss, where very many of the scenes haven't really felt like prologue material, and thus have made the prologues drag out longer than they strictly need to. And in other cases where the prologues didn't really feel like prologues at all, in a couple different cases where all of the scenes felt either so related to the main plot lines or so disconnected from everything that it was just like, why do we even have this here? This shouldn't exist in this space, but it does. Winter's Heart does bring that around a little bit. There are a couple scenes of the prologue that I really liked. The first scene in particular is maybe my favorite scene in the entire book. That might not be an exaggeration. I think the first scene of the prologue here is like my favorite part of the book, actually. And while I doubt very many readers of Winter's Heart, broadly speaking, are going to agree with that specific sentiment, in fact, I'm pretty sure a lot of people are going to be upset by that, I kind of felt that way. There were a couple scenes of the prologue that were great, even if the other scenes felt a little bit bloated and kind of continued that trend of just not really feeling like they belonged to a prologue, and thus kind of ruining the pacing of it. But kind of the general trend you'll hear at this point with me in the good is that all of my praises for this book have kind of little asterisks next to them, and that leads us right into the bad. Let's start with the bad associated with the good, and there are going to be some like minor spoilers here, so I guess if you really don't want to see any spoilers, you can skip to the next section, but it's nothing crazy. Like, I'm not going to be spoiling any actual plot stuff. Definitely nothing at the end of the book or anything like that, so don't worry about that, but I did feel like you at least deserved the warning. In the case of Elaine's plotline in Camelin, the fact that there's just no climax with it, that there's just a cliffhanger, that you get up to certain points, just like, oh yeah, we're right up on this, what is going to be some sort of climactic sequence, or what is at least some major event in the plot line, and then it just stops, is not something that I love about this book, and is not something that I've loved about a couple of the other plot lines within the series as of recent. It's just kind of a silly decision. Look no further than the way that Egwene's plotline ended in Path of Daggers. The exact same thing, coming right up on like, oh yeah, we're right at this climactic moment, this climactic sequence, or again, even if not an actual climax, a pretty major event that feels like something should immediately follow it a little bit more. There's just kind of nothing. And also, you know, kind of as a critique on a similar wavelength, as I mentioned with Egwene's plotline, Egwene's plot does not exist in Winter's Heart, basically. So, you know, the fact that there's kind of a cliffhanger-ish ending in that plotline in the previous book, and you don't see any of it here, is kind of aggravating, and I'm worried about the same thing happening with Elaine's plotline. I don't feel like Robert Jordan would go on to the next book without at least having that happen, but considering that I was really expecting for Egwene's plot to do something in here, I could be totally wrong. Sometimes his decisions as far as POV allocations are really, really strange. Now with the Matt and Ebu Dar plotline, got kind of similar critiques as far as like climax and stuff are concerned, but also a little bit different. We'll get there in just a second. A Crown of Swords ended with kind of the promise that we would be seeing something new, a new direction for Matt's plot and where he's actually going. And we didn't really get that in this book. We got some of it. We got some of the build of it, but generally speaking, the tone of the plotline as far as it exists in this book is near identical to the way that it was in A Crown of Swords in the first place, just with some extra cultural set dressing, and extra cultural as in like a new culture involved within the plotline. It just kind of feels like more of that same. When considering the end of A Crown of Swords, it felt like a big moment that was like, oh yeah, we're going to pick this story up and like it's going to have some big changes and we're going to be going in a new direction, and like we don't. It's basically in the exact same place, and you finally have Matt kind of actually picking up and going to go in that new direction in here. But even that takes a little bit of time to get through, and you have another climax problem, kind of as I hinted at, where the climax of Matt's plotline just kind of stops part way through. You don't have the completion of that sequence of events. There is a climactic moment that ends the sequence, which in and of itself is a pretty satisfying moment, but that's more of like the moment that you use to end a chapter within a plot line before you pick the plot line back up later in the book to actually finish off that climactic sequence. Like, that feels a little bit more appropriate in this case, but you don't get any more of that plot line in this book following that moment. So you're just like kind of left with a climax part way through, but not complete. I would liken both of these climax problems that I've talked about in association with Elaine's plotline and Matt's, and kind of relate them to the problems that I have with Song of Susanna and The Wastelands, respectively, from Stephen King's Dark Tower, in that Song of Susanna does not have a climax, like, at all. One of the plot lines has a relatively satisfying conclusion, but the other two have a cliffhanger. Like, they just end in a spot that doesn't make sense, and then part 1 of book 7 contains the entirety of the climax for the book. Like, it should have just been in Song of Susanna instead. This was kind of the problem with Elaine's plotline, and also Egwene's plotline from the previous book. Both of these characters have moments where it's just like, okay, we're right about to get something cool, you know, something happening here, and then nothing happens. You just don't see it, and that's kind of annoying. And then in association with Matt's plotline is more like the Wastelands problem, where Stephen King in the Wastelands just kind of stopped the climax part way through. Such an egregious decision that by the time he actually got around to book 4, the entire prologue of book 4 is just the start of the climactic sequence, the first half of the climactic sequence that was already in the Wastelands. So, you know, it's not that egregious in this case here, but it's pretty much, you know, it's a similar type of bad, in my opinion, where it's like, yeah, you have this moment to end on that's kind of good by itself, but like also not, because you just stop partway through, and that bugs me. It really does bug me. And then you also have a problem with climax, and we'll talk about this in a second as well, with Rand's plotline. And again, I'm not going to go into actual spoilers here, but the whole point of the book is something that like his plotline is building up towards, in especially the first half of Winter's Heart, or heck, maybe not even the first half, but like as far as his plotline is concerned in here, you have an end goal. You know what he's trying to do, what he's trying to accomplish, and you're working your way through getting there. And you're really excited for it, or at least I was really excited for it. But then in typical Robert Jordan fashion, it's like he's getting closer and closer to the end of the book, has forgotten what that climax was supposed to be, has completely forgotten to actually build it into what he's doing, and then remembers last second within the last chapter, or 2, I guess, depending on how you want to count it, and be like, oh yeah, I was supposed to do this thing this entire book, I guess I'm going to do it now. And then you have a super rushed and sudden climax, which mostly doesn't feel earned, because it's just snap and all of a sudden it's happening, another snap and all of a sudden it's done. And this is the problem with a lot of Robert Jordan climaxes, quite frankly. I mean, Eye of the World and The Great Hunt don't have bad climaxes, but they're kind of rushed and sudden and kind of confusing in their own ways, depending on how you read those books. And even if they're not confusing per se, they're still pretty sudden, where it's like, oh yeah, I guess we should probably have some sort of a climactic moment here. Boom, there's the moment, and then it's done. Shadow Rising also has a major problem with this, where it's like, you know, you're kind of building up towards something, and then all of a sudden it happens and it's done immediately, and it's like, what did I even just read? It's a moment where you have to reread the chapter basically just to even figure out what happened, because it was so sudden and so much happens in the space of nothing. So it's like, this is where Rand's plotline has a problem in this book. Like I said, just super rushed and very sudden. The content of the climax is, you know, kind of in the, well, I guess this is maybe not like those other examples I gave, maybe a little bit more like the problem with the climax of Path of Daggers, where you're funny how there's like a culmination, like all the problems that Robert Jordan has with writing a climax he has in this book. The problem with the Path of Daggers climax is that like most of the stuff that I want to see on the page isn't on the page at all. And then the moments that are on the page are basically irrelevant and or uneventful, where like the actual importance they have on the overall events that are happening is virtually nothing, to the point where you could skip almost all of those scenes and would miss effectively nothing. So not only is he not covering what I want to see actually happening, you also have the problem of the parts that are actually being covered just not being what I want to see, and also, like I said, pretty irrelevant. Like, you could gloss over it and nothing of real value was lost. And Winter's Heart kind of takes it definitely takes a page out of the playbook of Path of Daggers in that way of, oh yeah, we're just going to show you a bunch of different scenes that are largely irrelevant to what's happening. There's a little bit more relevance in this one compared to Path of Daggers, don't get me wrong, but it's like, it's not the best climax in the world. It's definitely not this really high moment in the series that a lot of people make the end of Winter's Heart to be. The actual event that I wanted to see happen, for example, is all but glossed over and effectively figurative, where it's more like implied rather than actually being, you know, kind of expressed like this cool thing is happening. And like, Robert Jordan is not a bad writer. He could very well decide to depict some of these things in a more explicit way that I would personally enjoy a lot more, and he just chooses not to, and that bothers me because, you know, the things that I like about what Robert Jordan is doing tend not to be the things that he wants to do, apparently. So what I want to see the most, he doesn't do, and what I don't really care about as much is what he tends to do. So it's kind of annoying, I guess I should say. In short, even all of the things that I did like, all of the things that I covered in the good, have aspects that I really didn't like, so that none of these plot lines were wholly satisfying. All of them had something that really bothered me. All of them had some aspect that really disappointed me. And like, that's kind of a problem. There's also the fact that Winter's Heart has the worst pacing of the series so far, by far. Like, it's not even a question in my mind that this has the worst pacing of the series. First of all, I already kind of commented about the prologue having a problem where there are a couple scenes that just really hurt the pacing of it because they're long and aren't really prologue related anyway, so that the two scenes that are prologue related just kind of get ruined by the way the rest of the prologue is structured, so that's a problem. But then you have the problem of the rest of the first third of this book is also just really slow, and only some of those chapters are in any way worth it. And even the worthy chapters are filled with 5 trillion names, just too much little information that's just like, wait a minute, who are these people again? When have these people ever showed up? And half of them are like, maybe people who've showed up a couple of times, like if that, and if they haven't had any important scene or anything like that, or are just glossed over characters from past plot lines, or in some cases are people from so many books ago that you frankly couldn't be expected to remember them all, and especially not if you were reading this in a timeline that was akin to the publishing of the books, where it'd be like, yeah, you'd have to reread the entire series before every book came out, and that would just be a nightmare, like an absolute nightmare. So the way that Robert Jordan just kind of conveys important information and utilizes a lot of tertiary, if that, characters, it isn't really effective. He could consolidate a lot of things, and this book is the best example of how plenty of things could be consolidated at this point and nothing of value would be lost. And yeah, it's just kind of annoying in that way as well. But then even when you get to the portion of the book which is broadly good, so basically the entire back half of Winter's Heart, where you have a lot of Matt and Rand's plot lines happening, you have the disappointment problems that I've already discussed up to this point. So you have a lot of the book which just kind of feels like nothing, and when it doesn't feel like nothing, it's just a slew of names that go in one ear out the other because why in the world are you expected to remember so many names that have essentially no bearing on the series, except for the moment when they are important, and at that point, you haven't kept track of their name? Robert Jordanisms, you gotta love them. Even after you've gotten past all of that, you just have a bunch of climaxes, or lack thereof, that are very disappointing and don't really do anything. People talk about the back half of Winter's Heart as being this really great moment for the series, as being like, oh, the slog kind of sucks, but the end of Winter's Heart is really great and makes it all worth it. I beg to differ, because the persistence of Robert Jordan's problems with climaxes and resolutions is also at its worst here. At this point in the series, every major plotline is at a bad form of cliffhanger, not the type of cliffhanger that's just like, oh wow, I can't wait to read the next book to find out what happens. It's more like the dumbfounding, why in the world did you even make this decision? That's kind of stupid type of reaction. And except for Rand, and Rand's the only plotline that doesn't have a cliffhanger. And again, just to say it one more time, even Rand's plotline has a very lacking climax and conclusion that I did not find satisfying in the way that it was told. I didn't really enjoy it much at all. That's unfortunate for sure, but like, I just don't get it. I don't get why the end of this book has such a high reputation when it is so mediocre. Like, it is just fine. And like, that's it. You know, that's as good as it gets. And I guess we'll move into the ugly for this. I haven't even talked about the first 6 chapters properly. I said how the first third of the book has effectively nothing happening, but holy crap, the first 6 chapters of this, what in the world were you even doing, Robert Jordan? These first 6 chapters are summarizable in maybe like a couple of sentences, basically, and that is literally it for the plot line that they are. Definitely not Rand, but Perrin. Perrin and Zareen's plotline is just so poorly done in this series. It is dumbfounding how bad Robert Jordan is at covering this plotline. It doesn't exist at all in book 5, which I guess you can kind of write off and understand. It's like, well, you know what, fair enough. I guess based off of the ending of Shadow Rising, I'll accept that they're not in book 5. But even if you disregard the fact that they're not in book 5 at all, they basically don't exist in book 6. And where they do exist, they might as well not, because they're so nothing in that book. In book 7, Perrin is used as an interesting viewpoint, like an interesting pair of eyes with which to view Rand for the first handful, or like 8 chapters or somewhere thereabouts, and then is effectively just cast off and then nothing for the rest of the book. The plotline isn't even that bad in Path of Daggers. Like, I actually kind of enjoyed that plotline a bit in Path of Daggers, and in that book is starting to do something. But then in this book, you have 6 chapters of them where literally all it does is get the characters of that plotline on the same page with where it ended in Path of Daggers, and then tell you that they're heading a certain direction, and then that's it. Like, literally it. At this point, like, you could have added maybe 1, at most 2 chapters onto this plotline at the end of Path of Daggers, where the plotline otherwise already ends, itself in a cliffhanger spot, mind you. Again, that kind of cliffhanger problem that Robert Jordan has been having these few books, and where, like, you could contain all of the information of the first 6 chapters of Winter's Heart into a couple chapters, put those into the end of Path of Daggers, and then not include the plotline at all in this book, and that would actually be a more sensible decision than what he did here. Because as is, the first 6 chapters of this are torture. They're just not good. You know, they're not the worst thing in the world, but they're not good. And then nothing happens after that. The plotline does not exist in the rest of the book. At this point, I'm wondering, like, you could have just done that, condensed those 6 chapters into 2, put them in Path of Daggers instead, and now I'm thinking that whatever plotline with these characters happens in book 10 could probably be put into this book instead, and by the way that people talk about Crossroads of Twilight, could probably itself be extraordinarily condensed, and then put into this book instead, and then maybe you don't have to have book 10 at all. Of course, I don't know, I haven't read Crossroads of Twilight yet, but I get the sneaking suspicion that that's going to be my critique by the end of that book, is that you could split it into other books and then cut all of the fluff, and then you wouldn't have a book that doesn't exist or something. I don't know. The point that I'm making is that the parent plotline is just stupid. How Robert Jordan can be so just incapable of handling who is purportedly one of his main characters is astounding. Like, Perrin is Taverin alongside Matt and Rand. Why in the world is he relegated to literally nothing of importance? And like, sure, you can consider what he's doing in Path of Daggers and I guess technically this book, if you really want to consider it that, as like maybe important for the future, and I'm convinced that it probably is, but it's nothing that needs to be taking this long. I mean, as is, I'm 99% certain that there is a major timeline discrepancy at this point, and that Perrin's plotline is nowhere near in sync with the others, and that it's like behind by a significant portion of time, and that's probably going to be bad here in a couple of books, when all of a sudden Perrin needs to be in line with everybody else, and now you just have to have a ton of it happen, because Robert Jordan could not possibly conjure up anything interesting to happen in this plotline, and then just to get it up to speed, just to get it caught up with everything else. And like, there's no excuse for that. If Robert Jordan would just actually plot out things and outline them in a thought out way, Perrin would not be, frankly, so undeservedly sidelined. It's just kind of frustrating. It's not even annoying at this point. It is actively frustrating. I'm upset with Robert Jordan for being incapable of handling Perrin in any reasonable way. Like, it is genuinely kind of pissing me off at this point. So like, that's the ugly. What in the world is Robert Jordan doing with these characters and with this plotline? It's stupid. It is there's no excuse for it. Like, it is genuinely no excuse for it. So that takes us into the recommendation for Winter's Heart, and I guess I'm glad that I didn't have as many notes for this book as I thought I would, because I've been rambling about them for a long time. I figured that would be the case, and that's why I didn't make as many notes. In either case, the recommendation for Winter's Heart is a little bit complicated, because at this point it's basically getting into the sunk cost fallacy, which I hear a lot of people talk about in regards to Wheel of Time. It's just like, at a certain point, you're only reading on to the next book because you feel like you've spent so much time reading the series that you have to, otherwise all that time was wasted. And like, I don't know, I'm not super inclined to subscribe to that theory, but I definitely see why people say that now. Like, it's starting to apply by the time this book is happening. It's not the worst book I've ever read, and it's not terrible, but it's very rough and bad enough that, quite frankly, I don't know if you need to read this. Like, people say to read summaries about Crossroads of Twilight, and while I wouldn't argue that for like, probably somewhere between half and 2/3, maybe 70% of this book at the absolute most, there's a significant chunk of this, like the first third of this book, where you could just read the summaries on the Wheel of Time fandom and you would have all of the important information, and you would have wasted many less hours. And like, in that way, that has me kind of worried for Crossroads of Twilight, because yeah, there is a not insignificant amount of this book that you frankly don't actually have to read, and a lot of it that is disappointing, that you should probably go in expecting this to be disappointing. I have no idea why the end of this book is as popular as it is, because I don't see it at all, not even a little bit. I mean, it's kind of like, at this point, The Shadow Rising and Lord of Chaos, where like, they're good in their own ways. They have great moments, but there's also a lot of bloat and a lot of problems with them that I don't understand how either of those books could be the best book in the series, because they're not. Neither of those books are, and this book is not the best part of the slog. No matter how you signify the slog, either being books 7 through 11 or 8 through 10 or whatever other organization you want to consider it personally, if you even believe there's a slog, because some people don't, even if I were to only include books 8 and 9, book 8 is a lot more enjoyable than Winter's Heart is. Yeah, like, I don't actually recommend Winter's Heart that much. In the end, I found myself incredibly disappointed with it, and I think that the hype around it doesn't make any sense. And put simply, like, if Winter's Heart was its own book, kind of just doing its own one arc thing, this is a book where, like, I would not recommend this if this was not, like, part of a broader series where it was 2/3 of the way through, basically. How this fits into the series makes the recommendation complicated because I just was not huge on this. Like I said, if this book were kind of its own thing or whatever, or if this were like a book 2 out of 3, you know, just any example where it's like its own thing or a middle book in a shorter series, I wouldn't really recommend it. I would be like, this isn't good enough to really justify spending the time with it. The fact that it's so far into the series is like, I don't know, I've recommended so many books previously in the Wheel of Time that, like, you kind of have to because of sunk cost fallacy, but, like, I kind of don't. This book was not great. I didn't enjoy it very much. And with all that being said, I might as well just kind of take that into the ranking, because before we get to Crossroads of Twilight, this book has me worried about Crossroads of Twilight, but before we get there, I did promise a ranking of the series as is at this point. Just note that this ranking is from my least favorite to my favorite. This does not mean from worst to best, per se, as I think that those are two different rankings in accordance with Wheel of Time. This is just from least favorite to favorite so far in the series. I just want to make that super duper duper clear, because I know somebody is going to take this out of context and be like, oh, he thinks this book is the worst or something, when that's not what I said. But in either case, Winter's Heart is easily my least favorite book, and it is the worst one. Like I said that Path of Daggers was the worst one up to that point. This one takes that throne all the way, and it's not even a question in my mind. Winter's Heart is not great. Like, again, it's not the worst book I've ever read. It's not terrible. It's not strictly not worth reading, but it is also easily the worst one in the series, and that puts it at the bottom at number 10. At number 9 is my, up to this point, most unpopular opinion in association with the series is The Shadow Rising. I don't think that The Shadow Rising is a bad book. I rated this 4 stars, mind you. That's a pretty good rating. For me, that's like right up there with average. For example, on my Goodreads page, 4 and 5 stars are easily my most common ratings. So like 4 stars is no problem at all. But Shadow Rising kind of disappointed me in a lot of ways, and it felt bloated actively at various points, and the only thing about Shadow Rising that I would say was exceptional was generally the Two Rivers plotline, and even the Two Rivers plotline had Zareen, which almost made me DNF this thing about a third of the way through. So, like, you know, it's not a bad book, but easily my least favorite. Aside from Winter's Heart, like up until reading Winter's Heart, this was my least favorite. At number 8 is the other unpopular opinion, which is Lord of Chaos, in that Lord of Chaos has some great stuff. I think the first third of it is a fantastic opening, and I think that Dumai's Wells is incredible. Like, by no means an overrated climax. One of the few climaxes of the series that I think really actually does a great job at what it's trying to do. But there's enough bloat in this and enough structural problems that make it feel much longer than it already is, which, mind you, it's basically tied with The Shadow Rising for the longest book in the series, which kind of actually really affected the reading experience for me. It was a book that, because the Bowl of the Winds plotline starts in the final third of this book, made the final third of Lord of Chaos feel like another Act 1 again. And after Act 2 was already a little bit bloated and overlong, that was a major problem in pacing and really hurt my experience. So, least favorite 3 books of the series, definitely Winter's Heart, then Shadow Rising, then Lord of Chaos. Next, we have the 3 entries of the series that were also not quite 5 stars, but I still really enjoyed for one reason or another. This is going to be entries 7 and 6, which I am going to consider to be interchangeable for all intents and purposes, and those are books 7 and 8 of the series, A Crown of Swords and The Path of Daggers. If you're going to ask me which one of these I think is the better book, A Crown of Swords is the better book between the two of them, but I just had so much fun with The Path of Daggers that there was, honestly, I think up until a couple of weeks ago, if I thought about Path of Daggers, I was like, I think I might prefer that over A Crown of Swords, just because I had so much fun with so much of it. But given how much I don't love and am disappointed by the climax of Path of Daggers, that's ultimately what kind of makes it below. So like if you force me to choose a ranking for these right now, I would put Path of Daggers at 7 and A Crown of Swords at 6. But like I said, these are virtually interchangeable. One of them is obviously the better book, but the other one I just had so much fun with that I like kind of have to acknowledge that. And then in 5th place is going to be New Spring, a book that I genuinely really loved. This was like the only book of the series that I would put at 4.5 out of 5, whereas all of the books below this on the ranking are either 3 or 4 out of 5, where Winter's Heart and Path of Daggers are the only 3s. The others are 4. But New Spring was like very nearly perfection. I just really enjoyed this thing all the way through. I plowed through it. It doesn't help, of course, that it's very, very short. But I had such an enjoyable experience with New Spring as well that, like, I look at it in accordance with all these other books. I'm like, I can't rank this below A Crown of Swords. Like, well, no, I can't do that. I just loved New Spring too much. Plus, being able to see more Moraine was awesome. Next up, we're going to go through the top 4 books of the series, all books that I have rated 5 stars. So books that I enjoyed a ton for one reason or another, and frankly, where these kind of exist on the list comes down primarily to just preference, because like I said, they're all 5 stars. I loved them all. So in the number 4 spot is going to be The Great Hunt. Probably my least favorite of the first trilogy of the series, but still a great book. Like I said, still 5 stars, an experience that I really enjoyed, that I had a really fun time with, and a book that proves that Robert Jordan can do relatively meandering plot lines well, where a lot of this book is kind of like active travel time, just between a couple of different locations, but where the tensions of certain plots and where a couple specific scenes are kind of still seared into my memory that just make this a really enjoyable time, and where Robert Jordan proves that he can subvert expectations on where a book might go in accordance with kind of the title and where things are left off at the end of the previous book in ways that are just enjoyable. I really enjoyed The Great Hunt. Great book, pun intended, as King James would say. The Great Hunt is great. I really loved it. In 3rd place is going to be The Eye of the World. This is my other unpopular opinion. Aside from putting more of the popular books lower in my ranking, putting Eye of the World so high on there is probably an unpopular opinion. But I loved this thing. Like, when I read it, I kind of went in expecting this to be like a mediocre, kind of just, a retrot of Fellowship of the Ring, and to be mediocre and bloated and kind of boring and, not really doing its own thing. But in the end, none of those problems affected me at all. In fact, I don't think that this is a retread of Fellowship of the Ring in virtually any meaningful way. Some people make certain comparisons that do make sense. Like, I'm not going to say that none of the comparisons make sense, but at the same time, it's also like, if you think that this is just straight up ripping off Lord of the Rings, that's uncharitable and silly. But even beyond that argument, just everything that The Eye of the World is really great, despite the climax being rushed, despite plenty aspects of some of those things being a little confusing, and certain decisions being a little bit different than you might expect. I loved traveling with these characters. I loved spending time with Rand. I loved all of the different scenes and where, disaster struck at every location. I just really enjoyed everything about this part of the journey. So it's still in my top 3 at this point. I have nothing but fond memories for Eye of the World. Even, looking back and being like, oh yeah, I really didn't like Nynaeve back in Eye of the World, but I have liked Nynaeve ever since like chapter 22 or something of The Great Hunt. Might be chapter 19, I forget off the top of my head. But ever since then, I've liked Nynaeve enough that retroactively, even in Eye of the World, I'm like, that was like one of my only problems with the book, and like, I don't have a problem with her character anymore, so I would go back and probably not be annoyed. But that takes us to the top 2, which of course are also pretty much interchangeable. Fires of Heaven and Dragon Reborn, which are both incredible. As far as being like more, how do I describe this? Being more like Wheel of Time. Like, if you were to just think of Wheel of Time and ask me what the best Wheel of Time book is, Fires of Heaven is probably that, because it does all of the Wheel of Time things very satisfyingly. The complaints about certain plot lines in this book also don't make sense to me. I loved everything about it, and generally just wonderful execution on basically all of the promises that were made within it. There were great climaxes in there. There were great storylines in there that promised those climaxes and actually delivered them, unlike Winter's Heart, that I really enjoyed. And then Dragon Reborn is probably my preference. Like, if you force me to pick my favorite book of the series, which I guess is what this ranking is, Dragon Reborn is my preference. I would put this probably at number 1 still. Just kind of wrapping up that first trilogy of the series, that first arc of the series, doing what it's doing, and also for being kind of a respect thing. I respect that Robert Jordan took this book in a very different direction than you would expect. The fact that it is titled after a character, and that character basically does not appear in the book, and is primarily viewed from external POVs, kind of as a tangential thing, rather than being the main character, because he's already the main character the first couple books, was a risky and strange decision that I think totally paid off. The handful of very minor complaints that I have about this book are also like minor and basically don't really matter. Like, I was a little bit worried about where Zareen's character would go for obvious reasons, but those problems weren't in this book specifically. I was also a little bit annoyed by just how often Nynaeve would tug her hair in this book specifically, because even though she does that in later books, it's nothing like this book. But like, again, it's very minor stuff. So yeah, that's basically the ranking. Winter's Heart, Shadow Rising, Lord of Chaos, Path of Daggers, Crown of Swords, New Spring, Great Hunt, Eye of the World, Fires of Heaven, and then Dragon Reborn. That is my list from least favorite to favorite. Once final time, this is not necessarily a ranking of worst to best, because I do think that list is a little bit different. Some of these things would largely be in the same places, like Winter's Heart would be at the bottom for sure. But like Path of Daggers would not be above Shadow Rising or Lord of Chaos if I was doing worst to best, for example. So there's that, but generally speaking, this is my list from least favorite to favorite. So 2/3 of the way through the series, having read 10 out of the 15 books of Wheel of Time, that is where things are at. So yeah, that is the review and the ranking, I guess, at this point. I still am planning on getting to books 10 through 11 later this year, and then I will be reading 12 through 14, the last few books of the series, early in 2026. I'm looking forward to finishing the series, that's for sure. Even if I am worried a little bit still about Crossroads of Twilight in particular, I'm still enjoying myself with the series, but it's also still been kind of so much. You know, by the time I'm done with the series, it'll have been probably 3 years since I started the first book, which is kind of a crazy thought, and it might even be just slightly over 3 years at this point in time. It's been well over 2 years since I started reading the series, and I still have a third of it left to go. So that's like, you know, kind of brain busting. And normally by the time that I do these review videos for Wheel of Time, I know when I'm going to be reading the next book. This time I'm a little bit less certain. Crossroads of Twilight is probably going to be happening in September, but that September is kind of just an estimate, because at the moment I'm reading Don Quixote as quickly as I possibly can. I'm trying to get through the first part, so like the first half of that book in August, and then probably will be reading part 2 through September. But there's also the question of whether I might plow through part 2 as early as I can in September and make the rest of the month into like October time for Crossroads of Twilight. But I also might start Crossroads of Twilight instead of starting part 2 of Don Quixote, and then reading that as quickly as possible to have the diary videos come out in September. Like, it's just kind of a mess. I don't know when precisely I'll be reading it, so just kind of keep an eye out on the channel. Of course, my monthly reading wrap-up and TBR videos are going to have more information on that by the time the monthly reading wrap-up and TBR for September comes out. That will definitely be telling you whether I'm going to be reading Crossroads of Twilight in September, or whether I've already started it at that point. I have no idea what's going to happen. And then also my bi-weekly update videos, which come out every other Sunday. Those tell you what I'm actively reading, and then give you an idea of what I'm more or less planning to be reading over any given 2-week period. So check those out if you're a little bit more curious. The Fortnite on the Isle videos, those bi-weekly updates, also tell you what videos will be coming out, so they'll also tell you when I'm going to be posting the Wheel of Time Diaries in association with any of these books, but I genuinely have no idea what the rest of my reading plans for the year at this point look like. There are a couple of specific events and certain books that I'm reading that are really long and that are going to take a lot of time, and certain events that I'm going to be going to late in the year that are really going to affect where some of my TBR actually falls and what I read when. So a lot of it is just going to be playing it by ear. So I guess all that to say that I don't know when I'm reading Crossroads of Twilight, but just keep an eye out on the channel and you'll figure it out when I do, probably. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in whatever videos I upload next.